A reading from Luke chapter 9, verses 21 through 27. He sternly ordered and commanded them not to tell anyone, saying, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." Then he said to them all, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit them if they gain the whole world but lose or forfeit themselves? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Indeed, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God."
There's an old proverb often attributed to Alexander Hamilton that says, "Those who stand for nothing fall for anything." It's a timeless reminder that without clarity about the beliefs or principles that guide our lives, we are likely to be swayed by just about any idea or opinion that may come along, even if it contradicts our true values. This is true of every generation. The writer of Ephesians describes it as being like children tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. As we've seen throughout this series on the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, this clarity about knowing what we stand for, or better yet, knowing who we follow, is what keeps us from falling for anything or following anybody. For Bonhoeffer, following Christ means rejecting all other earthly powers or attachments that would make ultimate claims upon our lives, including and especially Adolf Hitler. This is the theological linchpin of Bonhoeffer's political resistance to the Nazi regime. Following Christ means one cannot give allegiance to the Führer. But not every German at the time was clear about what they stood for. In fact, it would be a fallacy to assume that anyone, including Bonhoeffer, believed or acted with absolute moral clarity in the face of the regime, in part because the clear boundaries between Christianity and nationalism had been slowly eroded. In 1933, as Hitler assumed power and the wind of National Socialism swept across Germany, a Christian nationalist movement called the German Christians emerged in Berlin. The guiding message of the German Christians was that the racist, anti-Semitic, blood and soil policies of the Third Reich were the fulfillment of Scripture and the will of God for Germany. This quasi-religious message seduced a people who were looking to restore their nation to glory after suffering a humiliating defeat in World War I and heavy reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. The economy was in shambles. The people were demoralized and restless. The German Christian movement offered hope by wrapping Nazi ideology in Christian semantics. One of its leaders, Reinhold Krauss, put it this way: "When we draw from the gospel that which speaks to our German hearts, then the essentials of the teachings of Jesus emerge clearly and revealingly, coinciding completely with the demands of National Socialism, and we can be proud of that." This is how we lose moral clarity in the face of evil. We reduce the Bible to generalities while ignoring the particulars. We dilute the non-negotiables of the gospel to so-called essentials. We proof text the Bible apart from its whole so that we can make the Bible pretty much say whatever we want it to say. Bonhoeffer understood that this is how Germans might eventually come to stand for nothing and fall for anything. Evil, as it so often does, had appeared to his contemporaries disguised in Christian garb, a wolf in sheep's clothing, as Jesus called it. And it was vital to find clarity about what they believed and who they followed and what they stood for and who they stood with. Soon after Hitler assumed power, Bonhoeffer preached a sermon in London in which he spoke these words, which are as relevant today as they were in 1934. He said, "Christianity stands or falls with its revolutionary protest against violence, arbitrariness, and pride of power, and with its plea for the weak." Over the subsequent 10 years of his life, Bonhoeffer would protest that arbitrariness of the German Christians by joining a resistance movement, founding a seminary, writing, teaching, praying, preaching. He would become a spy, conspire to overthrow the government, and join a failed plot to assassinate Hitler, which would lead to his execution. On April 9th, 1945, Bonhoeffer was marched naked to the gallows at Flossenburg concentration camp, and he was hanged. He was 39 years old, according to his close friend, Eberhard Bethge. Moments before Bonhoeffer was taken away from his fellow prisoners to be executed, he spoke these final words to his guard. He said, "For me, this is the end, but also the beginning." Much has been written about these last words of Bonhoeffer. They are inspiring, prophetic, deeply pastoral, and hopeful. Some hear them as a daring profession of faith spoken by a modern-day Christian martyr. And perhaps we wonder, if we standing on the gallows facing our death, might we be so bold to suffer and die for what we believe? But it's hard to imagine that Bonhoeffer didn't speak these words with trembling lips and a catch in his throat, because he was just as human as the rest of us. And more importantly, these words are simply a reflection of what he actually believed about discipleship and what we've been talking about over these last few weeks, that following Christ is all about endings and beginnings, leaving behind our attachments to this world to go wherever it is that Christ is calling us to go. Only what is required between such endings and beginnings, he said, is suffering. The cross of Christ, that is. Bonhoeffer writes about the must of suffering that always comes with following Christ. Pointing to the teaching of Jesus, we read today from Luke's Gospel. "If any wish to come after me," says Jesus, "let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will save it." Bonhoeffer wrote that self-denial and suffering is the badge, he said, of true discipleship. That those who are not prepared to experience suffering and rejection are not disciples. A disciple is someone, he said, who shares in the suffering of Christ. Discipleship is commitment to the suffering Christ. And this is a message so foreign to us moderns, especially those of us in the U.S. So much of American Christianity is manufactured around the avoidance of suffering, the elimination of our suffering, the overcoming of our suffering, and the causes of our suffering. And the assumption for many Christians is that suffering is God's punishment for our sin or the testing of our faith, or suffering is a sign of spiritual weakness and God's absence for which we should be ashamed. Or suffering can be avoided if we just do better or try harder or give more or pray harder. Or that moral perfection can somehow make us immune to suffering. And so in our personal experiences of suffering, we are often prone to ask hard questions like, what did I do that God would allow this suffering to happen to me? Or how can I be stronger and overcome or conquer this suffering? Or what is God's purpose behind this suffering? Or where is God in my suffering? Or what deal can I cut with God to get me out of this suffering? And yet, Bonhoeffer speaks of the must of suffering. By must, he doesn't mean that suffering is something we must go and seek out, or something we must endure to earn God's grace, or some religious act we must perform to prove we're a Christian. What he means by the must of suffering is that suffering is simply part and parcel of Christ's call from death to new life. Bonhoeffer says that in our suffering, we experience fellowship or community with Christ, whose way to new life is always through suffering and death to an old life. Consider this just on a personal level. There must be, and look, if we're honest, there always will be, experiences in our lives in which we find ourselves in circumstances we cannot fix or control or explain or change or even comprehend. And maybe we lose a job or a fortune or a reputation or a marriage or our faith. Or maybe we endure an illness or a betrayal or grief or a major setback or an unexpected life transition. These are all types of necessary suffering. Not necessary because they were somehow foreordained or predetermined by God, but necessary in that suffering in general is inevitable and will eventually come to all of us in some very particular form. And when it does come, if we deny our pain or avoid or bury or run from our suffering, we will keep ourselves from our own spiritual transformation. We will want what was instead of what might come from what now is. And in that moment, we will forget, as the writer Paula d'Arcy says, that God comes to us disguised as our life. God comes there with a call in the midst of our suffering. It's in suffering where we meet Christ, and if we dare to meet Christ there, the call of Christ is always to die to the old self and to what once was, and to follow him into new life. Bonhoeffer says that suffering or the cross isn't something we need to seek out. It's already present. And all that's left is to pick up our cross. The cross is laid on every Christian. The task is to pick it up and in doing so to abandon our old attachments to this world. I've seen this at work in the lives of so many people. The man who said to me when I lost my job, I thought it was the end of the world. I wasn't sure I'd ever recover or what I'd do next, but in my prayerful searching, he said, I eventually found my true calling in life, and I'm living it now. And it never would have happened had I not lost that job I thought I couldn't live without. Or the woman who said to me, after my divorce, my pastor told me that I was no longer a biblical woman. And I was ashamed to go to church for years, and it wasn't until I gathered the courage to leave that church and find a new church and heal my spiritual trauma that I finally found God and true faith. Bonhoeffer spoke of such experiences as the dying of the old self, that the call of Christ to something new. He said famously, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. He said it may be a death like that of the first disciples who had to leave home and work to follow him, or it may be a death like Luther's who had to leave the monastery and go out into the world, but it is the same death every time. Death in Jesus Christ, the death of the old man at his call. And if it's true that in our encounters with personal suffering we experience fellowship with Christ that leads to new life, then we can grasp Bonhoeffer's equally urgent point, that suffering which involves carrying the burdens of others is what distinguishes the Christian existence from what he calls the natural existence. What does Bonhoeffer mean by natural existence? He's talking about all the identity markers that define us and divide us from others. American, Canadian, Democrat, Republican, Catholic, Protestant, male, female, straight, gay, all these artificial labels we use to sort people and group our lives and categorize our world and organize our ideologies. We tend to put all these identity markers above everything else so that we do not know what we really stand for anymore or who we ultimately follow. Bonhoeffer says the Christian existence calls us out of our attachments to these markers. When we follow Christ, these labels no longer define who we are and who we are not. The cross, the suffering of Christ, breaks down all these barriers and social markers and boundaries. And when we enter Christ's suffering, we die to our old natural humanity and are reconstituted as a new humanity. Old ideologies, old loyalties to our personal and partisan and national, even our religious tribes. These attachments are all left behind, and we take upon ourselves the burdens of our neighbor. And suddenly the plight of our neighbor matters to us, becomes our responsibility, and so too does forgiving the sins and healing the brokenness of our neighbor. Because if Christ comes to us disguised as our life, then God also comes to us disguised in the lives of others. And when we suffer for others, bearing the burdens of others, forgiving the sins of others, confronting the evils of others, we participate in what Bonhoeffer called Christ's suffering of reconciliation. And it's this participation in suffering that becomes a necessary form of resistance because it heals the world. It calls us into the world. It calls us toward the neighbor. It refuses to allow us to stand back and turn a blind eye to evil or human suffering. So that then every act of mercy becomes an act of resistance. Every word of forgiveness, every cup of cold water to the thirsty, every kindness, every pardon, every intercession, every loaf of bread broken and shared, these all become acts of resistance against the darkness and indifference of the world. In the 1930s, a brilliant young Jewish writer and philosopher named Simone Weil applied for a leave of absence from a teaching job to work as an unskilled laborer, first in an electrical plant and then as a machine operator for Renault. She had had a conversion experience in which she said, quote, "Christ himself came down and took possession of me." She felt called to leave behind those attachments to her old life and to follow Christ. Over the objections of her family, she changed her name, rented a room near the factory, tried to live a life that was no different from the other factory workers. Long hours, low pay, little food. She worked in a Paris factory for 2 years until her poor health forced her to return to teaching. When Hitler's armies invaded France, Weil was forced to flee to America with her family in 1942, but was soon overcome with guilt for having fled France while her compatriots suffered. After 7 months in America, Weil left for England to join the Free French. Because she was a Jew, she was only allowed to do paperwork for the movement. But wanting to do more, she chose to voluntarily limit herself to the same food rations the occupied French could get with their food cards, believing that by taking less food for herself, there would be more food for others. In spring of 1943, Weil entered a hospital where she died of tuberculosis the following August at the age of 34. Many historians have argued that Simone Weil made so many unnecessary choices. She was an educated person of means, a writer, a philosopher, a teacher. She could have chosen any number of more convenient ways to make a difference. But she chose to live among her people and to suffer with them. Why? Because she understood what Bonhoeffer was trying to say all along. The Christian existence calls us out of our attachment to the natural ways we define our lives and demarcate our boundaries. The cross breaks down all these barriers and social markers, and it reconstitutes us as a new humanity, so that the plight of our neighbors matters to us, and we are willing to suffer for our neighbor. Simone Weil said, "To be a hero or a heroine, one must give an order to oneself." A test of what is real, she said, is that it is hard and rough. Joys are found in it, not pleasure. What is pleasant belongs to dreams. Our takeaways for today: those who stand for nothing fall for anything. Christ calls to us from our own suffering. Christ calls each of us toward the suffering of others.